In today's episode of HR Visionaries, we're going to talk to Giuseppe from Sama. He will tell us a lot about how to develop people. Stay tuned. Welcome to HR Visionaries, where we unlock the secrets of modern HR. I'm Benjamin, your host. Join us as we shed light on today's HR universe with HR leaders and innovators from across the globe. Whether you're an HR pro, a business leader, or just curious about the future of work, this is your shortcut to the forefront of HR innovation. Brought to you by Hire, the AI talent attraction platform. Welcome to our latest episode of HR Visionaries. I'm looking forward to my guest today, Giuseppe. Giuseppe, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Giuseppe, could you give us a quick download in 5 sentences? Who are you?
Sure. So I'm an HR professional. I work as a director of talent management for a company called Sama. Been working in HR for about 12, 13 years now. Did a little bit of everything in HR at this point. So touched on everything before taking a step into a leadership role. And separate from Sama, I also have my own little consulting company. It's called Mint Talent Solutions, where mostly the service offering is professional coaching, but also some other things like learning and development and HR consulting. So I really have a wide range of different things that I do, and always in the HR, talent management, talent development field.
You just mentioned that, prior to taking the leadership role, you had many different roles in HR. So was HR something you always considered your profession, your destiny?
No, absolutely not. I like to say, as cheesy as it sounds, I like to say that HR found me in a way. Um, I think without knowing it throughout my career, at least in the early years of my career, I was always doing HR without realizing that I was doing HR. When I worked in retail stores, for example, just as a part-time employee, I was the one that was hiring and onboarding everyone in the store. Responsibility that I just kind of took on my own. I was the one that was training all the employees and making sure that we were all engaged and really doing all of these things that I guess you could qualify as human resources without actually having the title of human resources. At the time, I was planning to become a history teacher, actually, studying history and liberal arts, and had a totally different path. But this experience in retail, I was working for H&M, actually, but in store and in a mall. And that experience um, was really interesting because the leadership team saw something in me from an HR perspective, I guess. And I was offered a role as a recruiter. Uh, so I was studying history and then started this full-time role as a recruiter and was kind of doing both in tandem and realized, hey, maybe I should be working actually in HR and studying in HR, and kind of fell into it that way and realized that it actually did make a lot of sense for me.
I think it's actually quite interesting that for many people, it's the very same for me, right? So I started studied business, started in a banking role, and then over time, you're more and more engaged in recruiting people, and it then kind of finds you while you feel very passionate about getting people on board that share your vision, share the values of your company, and that fit, right? So I think it's quite remarkable how this development then turns out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for me, I think I realized that HR had a lot of elements of the other jobs that I wanted to do. Like I wanted to be a teacher, and the piece of HR that I love the most, obviously, is learning and development. So it just kind of made sense. It filled that need to teach, but also filled other needs and other values that I had, specifically growing people and seeing the change in people and really partnering with them on their growth trajectory and journeys. So it really ended up being something that fulfilled me quite a bit. It still does.
It's excellent. And can you tell us a bit about your way from H&M to Sama?
Sure. So the way that I built my career, and I think this would be the advice that I would give anyone building a career in HR is try and get as much experience as possible in all of the different elements of HR that exist, especially if you want to go into some kind of leadership role. It's really useful to be able to think back and say, okay, when I was a recruiter, this was my experience. When I did compensation, this was my experience. So from a very early stage in my career, that's kind of what I had in mind. I wanted to get as many different experiences as possible. So started at H&M, did recruitment for basically retail stores. It was doing retail recruitment for all of Eastern Canada. I think I covered maybe 20 or 25 stores, something like that. And then was there for, I think, 3-ish years, and moved on to work in tech for the first time, for a company called Autodesk, which you probably know. I went there for a 2-year contract. I was doing program management, university recruitment, building their university recruitment program in Canada, and really building out the program and recruiting the talent for our internship program, which was really robust. So did that for 2 years, got my experience in like more of a project management, program management, HR area. And then moved on back into retail. I worked for a company called Reitmans, which is a Canadian, major Canadian retailer. And you'll see my whole career is mostly retail and tech. I call them my two loves. But went back into retail, worked at Reitmans for a while, started in talent acquisition, but very quickly moved into learning and development, where I was building out all of the soft skills programs for all of our corporate staff, which was, I think, about 800 people at the time. And at that point, I had really fallen in love with learning and development, and really kind of wanted to continue in that route. So stayed in that role, built out some really interesting programs. And that was, again, learning and development, but also program and project management, which is always like something that sneaks in when it comes to HR. There's always that project management element, I think, in a lot of our roles. After Reitmans, I joined the company for just a year. It wasn't a fit for me necessarily, but I joined as an HR business partner, in which I believe I was the only HR business partner at the time, and I covered everything. So it was really HR BP, but also taking care of learning and development, and also taking care of talent acquisition, and also doing a little bit of compensation. So really kind of touched on a lot more elements. After that, I went back into tech, and I stayed in tech till this day. I joined a company called Coveo, which is a AI company based in Quebec. Amazing company. One of my fondest experiences of my whole career, I would say. Really interesting talent. I worked as HR business partner there, which is a role that, if I were to reshape my career, I would say HR business partnership is something that I would loop in and out of more often. I think, doing recruitment, going into HRBP, then doing compensation, HRBP, I think it's a great way to take all the skills that you're learning and really apply them. So did HRBP for, I think it was a year-ish. And then I ended up being the leader of the HR business partnership team. So I managed a team of 5 HRBPs for a while, and I was super, super happy at that job. I don't think I would have ever left if it wasn't for Sama, I would say. But then Sama came knocking at my door. They were very persistent. I was very persistent, saying, no, 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 I'm super happy at Coveo. I love this company. But they really hooked me in with their mission, which we could talk about later. But they really hooked me in with the mission. I joined the organization and quickly grew. So I started just for a couple of months in an HR business partnership role, and then very quickly became the director of talent management, where now I cover HR business partnership, of course, learning and development, compensation or total rewards, engagement, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So I have a team here of 5 people as well, and we span globally. So North America, Europe, Asia, and East Africa as well.
Cool. Well, you mentioned that, or you couldn't resist that offer from Sama, given their mission, and we already like to talk about that. So, how did they communicate that mission to you, and what is the mission?
So what's really interesting about Sama, so we're a computer vision and data labeling services company. So um, essentially we have a huge workforce that trains AI models for our customers. So essentially to make it very, very simple, AI needs to learn, AI models need to learn, and someone needs to teach those AI models what things are. So if I have, I don't know, 1 million data sets, and in all of those data sets, I want my model to say, these are where the stop signs are. I need someone to actually go through those data sets and label all of those stop signs so that the model can learn and improve. So a big part of our workforce in East Africa does that work. And the reason why that workforce is in East Africa is because our founder had the philosophy that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity isn't. So in fact, we hire and train people from underrepresented or developing regions, specifically in East Africa, really give them the tools, the training to get a lot of times their first job in a corporate environment, and give them training so that they can start building a career and a lot of times pull themselves and their families out of poverty. Um, so it's rare that you work for, in my opinion, it's rare that you work for a tech company that has this incredible social mission. It's not always easy. I mean, it has its struggles, of course. But at the end of the day, we're doing really good work. We're making a difference, and that's really what sold me.
I imagine that being also kind of challenging, having teams distributed globally, and how do you then approach the entire topic of approaching people to join Zama, given well East Africa is obviously very different to hiring in the US, in the North Americas in general, in Europe. So how do you deal with those challenges?
I'm probably not the best person to answer this because I don't cover the talent acquisition piece, so I don't want to overspeak. Um, but we definitely, in a lot of ways, and not just with talent acquisition, with every program that we do, we really have to more and more consider culture. Uh, and it's as simple as project managing something. The way you project manage something in North America is going to be very different than the way you project manage something in East Africa. You're thinking about different types of employees, different backgrounds, different experiences, different ways of working too. You know, the North American, which I'm learning after having moved to Europe, the North American way of working is not incredibly a healthy way of working. And a lot of time and a lot of times I think there's an expectation that everyone works at that pace, but really it's not the case. So adapting to different cultures and adapting to different ways of working is incredibly important. And we're learning this every single day. Um, in fact, I would say if any of the listeners haven't read this book, I would really suggest reading The Culture Map. Um, I think the author is Aaron Mayers, if I'm not mistaken, but really talks about the differences in cultures and in different areas of the world. It's super interesting.
Well, you mentioned before that your field of responsibility is also engagement, which I think is something that is unfortunately very often overlooked. That well, you can't take employees for granted, but you need to make sure that they are not only aligned with your mission at the day they sign the contract, but also years later, and they are engaged in what the company does. So how do you guys approach this?
We're communicating as much as possible. So it's really important that the employees understand the impact that the organization has. I think that's our when we think about why people have joined Sama, and I said it, but I think almost every employee that works at Sama will tell you, the mission is the number one piece. So we've actually got a team called our impact team that really does the work of understanding the impact that we have on people in the East Africa region and all over the world, and creates a story and shares that with our employees to keep them engaged. Because engagement these days is not really about pizza at the office anymore. It's not even about getting people necessarily at the office anymore, especially when you're a global organization.
Yeah.
And post-pandemic, it's hard to get people in. And I don't think people necessarily always want to be in an office space anymore. So you really have to get creative. And I think the mission for us is a way to do it for sure. And also I think, when you work in a startup environment, and this is why I love startups so much, you get this collective desire to make it work. You go through the tough times together, you go through the good times together, and you all have this desire to, okay, I want this to work. I want to eventually get to an IPO. I want this company to be successful. And I think that also keeps people engaged. And it's something that we actually could do a lot more work getting people together on that point.
Well, an aligned mission, well, everyone collectively working on getting things working. How do you approach this? So what are your well, ways how to make this happen, given obviously this is kind of what everyone tries to achieve. I think many companies try to achieve but fail, but how do you achieve that?
We do it with communication, leadership communication as much as possible. And I would say this is one of the first companies where we work with the leadership team and the CEO to be as transparent as possible with employees. More so than I've ever seen before. A lot of companies that I've worked at, you get the generic responses or communications from CEOs, which is very normal. Here we work with a CEO that's very, very candid, that really gives us the lay of the land as it is, and helps us to understand what's going on in the business. And I think that helps us a lot. It puts us all on the same level playing field. And we work very closely on making sure that communications are as transparent as possible, which is a big deal.
How do you avoid over communicating? So in particular in a startup environment, there can also be, well, occasionally an over communication in terms of like, well, if the CEO would share every kind of latest development around investors, for example, that, well, over the last years were perhaps not as great as previously. So therefore you also don't want to over communicate, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in a startup environment, it's a little bit of a trial and error sometimes. You over communicate and then you're like, ooh, I don't know if that was necessarily too much or enough. So we're kind of finding that balance and adjusting. But it's not just, I think one way to avoid it is that it's when we talk about communication, it's not just one person that's creating these communications. There's a team of people that review communications, that make sure that things kind of make sense for where we are in the business and how they're going to be received by employees. So a lot of it is the HR team. So myself and my boss is the senior vice president of HR or people. But we have some other internal stakeholders that take a look at that and try and make sure that we're on the right track.
Well, given you're an HR professional for quite some time, you obviously experienced lots of change in the HR environment, well, in the HR teams, in HR when it comes to technology. Can you tell us a bit about what has really made a difference for the teams you have been working in?
I think, and this is the reason I decided to really focus on HR. I think HR has been going through a transition for a long time. I think if you look at HR 20 years ago, you will see that it was a really administrative function, not highly strategic. Maybe there were some key HR leaders here and there that were strategic, but not necessarily a highly strategic function. And I think the shift that's happened in the last decade or so really makes it so that a lot more strategic minded people are going into HR, that HR I know this is a cliche, but that HR has a seat at the table and HR is really there to advise senior leadership. And this major change, I think, has been one of the best things for HR and for companies in general. And you really see this evidenced specifically with the HR business partnership role. Although I think more and more every role in HR is becoming this advisory consultative partner. But the HR business partnership role really shows that. It's not about, hey, you have time off, let me show you how to fill in the paperwork. It's more about, hey, I'm going to work with the leaders in the organization to get them to another level, to make sure that they're the best managers or the best leaders that they can be. And then I'm going to trust that they're going to use those skills to manage their teams effectively. And that changes the dynamic completely. That really is where you see us making more of an impact on organizations, and really kind of showing the value of HR and using this strategic advisory consultative approach, which to me has been a game changer in the industry.
And it is probably also due to the fact that most companies or many companies now work with very highly skilled people. So where previously, like let's say 30 years ago, some of the work people did was very commoditized, and therefore, well, getting the best talents on board, getting the best talents, or keeping the best talents was probably not that critical. While nowadays it's like having a great new hire, having a great person to stay on board is absolutely business critical for most companies. I think we saw that about what happened at OpenAI, for example. So many people, like 90%, threatening to walk out, and the board caved then, right? So I think that is also contributed to HR being not just at the table for the sake of being there, but being an essential part at in the management decisions.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're talking about talent in a way that we've not really ever talked about talent before, and really focused on finding the absolute best talent possible at all times and as quickly as possible. And then when we have that talent, making sure that they stay. And
So
this
it
is,
sounds like an easy task, right?
yeah, no, it's super easy. And you do it with pizza parties.
Exactly. That's a weapon that always works, right?
Yeah, exactly. But no, you're totally right. I think talent is incredibly important, and most companies, at least in the tech space, are really starting to realize this or have already realized this, which is where the investment in HR comes in. And where you're investing in really strong HR professionals that understand this and that can really make a difference when it comes to talent.
Can it also talk us a bit about your experience in terms of how the tech landscape changed for HR? So when you think about recruiting, when you think about learning and development, obviously so much has changed. I remember those days when you were given, in terms of learning and development, those CDs where you could go through some courses that were updated 5 years prior to giving out the CDs, right? So that, or with you talk about early recruit or early talent recruiting, things have changed so much, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously things have been changing for the better in terms of learning and development. There's so many things out there right now that you can use for learning and development. Where LinkedIn Learning is just one example of how fast you can get learning content out to your employees, how fast you can create learning paths, and how you can monitor it and get data for it so quickly, and even evaluate the training effectiveness. Perfect example. I have a learning and development specialist, and yesterday, in just a few hours, she built a complete learning path for people transitioning from individual contributor to manager role. This 10 years ago would have taken weeks, months, and an incredible amount of money to purchase those CDs that you were talking about. That might not have even had the right content that was tailored specifically to our needs. Whereas now, having so much content out there really makes a difference. And it really gives us a chance to create that just-in-time learning experience for people that's also very relevant to their experience and their careers. From a recruitment perspective as well, I mean, when I was recruiting, when I was first recruiting, I was sifting through resumes one at a time. It's not the case anymore. Just the advancements with recruitment technologies, you can just sift through everything right away and look for keywords. Or I'm starting to see people using even things like ChatGPT to upload a resume and say, hey, should I hire this person or should I speak to this person? It really makes the process a lot faster, and it really makes the process a lot more effective. And when you're looking at things in that way, you're also in a lot of ways eliminating bias. If I upload a bunch of resumes and I say, should I hire these people, yes or no? There's no unconscious bias when it comes to the person's name, the person's gender, anything that's on the resume. It's really just the content that's there and if it's a fit or if it's not a fit.
And you also liberate yourself from the meaningless parts of the of work. So going back to the CDs, handing out the CDs, okay, the administrative work around who has what CD in what situation and when is it about to be returned, all that took,
Yeah.
it took like a lot of time, right? So and it was like utterly useless. However, there was no different way of doing that. And I think therefore technology can also help, well, liberating us from those things that don't create lots of value. However, they were necessary to be done.
Exactly. Exactly. I totally agree with you.
So I think it's a super, super interesting development. And you also talked about HR being project managers. Can you tell us a bit more about this? Given I totally agree that many people join the HR space because, well, they really like working with people, they really like learning about people's motivation, learning about people skills, and then you end up in projects. Some may feel very meaningful, others may feel less meaningful indeed. So can you talk us a bit about it through how do you think about this?
For sure. I think first and foremost, I think it's a misconception in a way. So for people that are thinking about joining HR, I think yes, if you love working with people, yes, go into HR, but there's another element to it, right? You have to think about, yes, I love working with people, but I love watching people develop, or I love giving people the skills that they need to do their job, or I love making sure that people are in the right place at the right time in their career. So there's always an added element to it. Being a people person in and of itself is not enough, I think, to make a really strong HR professional. You need that balance of, yes, I love being around people and I'm a people person, but also I want to see the success in people and I want to make real business change and I want to understand the business and where it's going from a goals perspective and how we can get there with talent. When it comes to I totally forgot your question at this point. Sorry, I got carried away.
You got carried away. No, I was talking about well, that people join the HR space for personal interactions, and then you end up as a project manager
Yeah.
and implementing a new ATS, for example, and you become more an IT project manager, which is perhaps not the role you signed up for in the first place.
Yes. I think exactly. So my point previously, I think, ties to this because if you join HR, you have to understand that you are the link between people and business. And sometimes the link between people and business is working on projects that make the business more efficient, a new ATS or a new way of creating the talent management cycles, implementing something like calibration. Like these are all innovations sometimes that you'll bring into an organization that, yes, have people at the heart of them, but really are business driven and business led. So a lot of times you end up managing these projects, and this is a skill set that's incredibly important. I think if you want to grow in an HR role, being able to manage a project effectively and being able to manage people within a project really, really makes the difference. Because for me, at least in my career, what I found is I found the most success when I was able to create really valuable projects or initiatives for the business with a talent lens.
So, um, how do you ensure that you keep the talent centricity or the candidate centricity? Because once you are well in your role as an HR professional, one of course naturally has a different kind of perspective.
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think keeping that in mind in everything that you do, is this gonna really create impact and value for the organization? And I think it's an easy one when you're working in HR. I think something that a lot of HR professionals deal with is a fear that they're not creating value in the organization. You know, we're not in sales, right? We're not revenue generating necessarily all the time.
Well, one could argue also
Yeah,
without
maybe
HR, there is no revenue generation,
yeah, maybe sometimes, yes.
right?
I think it's less clear. It's like
Yeah,
there's a less clear link,
not as
like
tangible, right?
exactly. And sometimes that creates, and I've seen it with people that I've managed, it creates this feeling of like, well, am I really adding value to the organization? But keeping in mind all the time, hey, yes, I am from a talent perspective. My initiatives have done this, this, and this. I've grown this person, and now they're leading this and changing the organization in this way, or I'm advising these directors, this CEO. It really does make a difference on at the end of the day. So keeping that in mind, I think is incredibly important to keep you pushing forward when it comes to talent initiatives. Um, and then really looking at the data that you get from these initiatives. For example, my last company, we implemented calibration, which is a 9-box grid. It's something that a lot of companies do. But the data that we got from that helped us to develop really interesting talent insights and give really specific and relevant advice to leaders to manage their talent. And that made the organization and the teams that we did it with much more efficient. So really thinking about, okay, what's the end goal here? And is this really going to make a difference to the organization? And thinking about it in that way will help you, I think, to focus on the right projects.
Um, Being a project manager, of course, requires also skills that one might need to learn, right? So how did you acquire those skills?
For me in my career, it was really just from the beginning. I think I was thrown into a lot of project-based work. I think my like I said, my job at Autodesk was all project-based. And by nature, I'm a very organized person. But if you're not those things, there are ways to learn. I mean, um, find mentors in your organization, start with stretch assignments, manage small projects or small initiatives, work with someone that's a really strong project manager in your team or in your field. And then, like we were talking about before, learning and development has increased dramatically in the last couple of years. Sign up to LinkedIn Learning, start listening to more podcasts about it. There's so much information out there that can give you kind of the technical. And then for the practical, like I said, I think stretch assignments is a great way to start.
You also mentioned that you run your own enterprise in terms of learning and development, um, coaching. Can you just tell us a bit more about this? So, is that also something that comes from your experience you collected prior to, hey, you need to stay on top of things, and therefore, yeah, I want to take action.
Yes. So I mean, I'm someone that I can't be idle. So I can do everything all at once to be as effective as possible. But I did a lot of thinking in the last couple of years on what it is that keeps me in HR and what it is that really that I really value. And for me, I think I said it a couple of times, is developing people. Developing people, whether they're in my team or whether they're in the organization, really seeing the change in them and seeing their careers grow and seeing them develop personally, professionally, whatever it may be. So naturally for me, coaching was the next step in my education, in my career. So I did develop I completed a coaching certification, and now I'm working as a professional coach, really for anyone in organization, whether it's career coaching, whether it's leadership coaching, really focused on goals, creating goals, developing yourself, developing your skill sets, and taking you to that next level. I think coaching is really powerful because it's a coach is a guide, but a coach is not going to do the work for you. So my work as a coach is to say, let's talk, let me hold up a mirror for you, let me ask you the right questions, let's reflect together, but let's get you to a place where you feel it within you that you'll have this change and you know how to affect this change. And it's been really rewarding. I think it's been an incredible journey so far. The business is building slowly and gradually. But I feel like there's a real feeling of fulfillment, that I'm really making a difference with my clients and changing them for the better and helping them change for the better. So it's been incredible, and it's directly linked to a lot of the work that I've done in HR. I mean, as an HR professional, a lot of times you're in this like weird, vague space of coaching and advising and consulting. But essentially, I've been working with leaders for over a decade now, and I understand the dynamics that leaders face, whether you're at manager level, director level, VP level, even CEO level. So that knowledge helps me to help people when they come into the coaching practice as well.
What were pivotal situations you experienced when coaching people, and afterwards you thought to yourself, well, the person I coached learned a lot, but I also benefited a lot from that situation?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of times coaching topics, although they might be really, really vague at first, all end up being quite similar at their core, right? A lot of people have some sort of feeling of imposter syndrome. A lot of people have some sort of feeling of insecurity about the next step in their career. These are themes that keep coming up, and you see it in coaching, and you see it in, just managing teams and managing people, that it's constantly, especially when it comes to high performers, it's constantly the same issues at the core that keep coming up. So from a learning perspective, even for me, as I'm coaching people, you really get to explore these topics in more detail. It helps you not only if you're a person, like I'm not perfect, I also struggle with some of these things. So it does help you out to a certain extent, but it makes you more knowledgeable as well to further coach other people, to further advise people, to be a more effective HR leader as well. So it's really a full circle type of thing. They help me as much as I help them, really.
What's your vision for HR for the next few years, for the next, for the next decade, so to say? I think it will be much more tech driven, not in terms of like, not just technology, but just also in terms of more tech thinking. But what are your ideas around that?
I think, yes, I think it's going to be a lot more tech driven. I think it's going to be a lot more um, efficient as well, just overall, I think because of the tech. We talk a lot about the transformation of HR, but it's not every industry and every company that's gone through that transition. So we have to keep that in mind, that that's still something that's happening. But I think over the next decade, maybe 10 to 15 years, this will be something that all companies have. And if you're looking specifically at tech, I think you can start seeing the trends that are going to trickle down into other industries as well. One of them being just flexibility in general. A lot of companies, a lot of tech companies now are hyper focused on flexibility. It's not the case all over the world. When we look at talent, I think we're headed to a place where we're not going to be evaluating talent based on hours worked, but we're going to be evaluating talent really based on objectives, which is a complete mind shift change in a lot of areas. So the way we manage people, I think, will change. The type of talent that we acquire based on that shift will also change. If you're hiring in a company that's highly flexible, you're going to tend to hire really high performing people because they don't necessarily need to be micromanaged. You know? And I think that plus all of the efficiency gains due to technology will really change the landscape of HR. I don't know what that means necessarily for our jobs. I think we're going to be probably even more consultative as HR develops and grows, and I think we're going to be real business partners even more so than we are now. Because like you said, we're going to be creating efficiencies that are going to reduce the amount of potentially administrative work that we have to do, which will leave space for us to focus on more strategic elements.
Yeah, you just mentioned that, well, the shift from evaluating employees on hours worked towards like outcome. So shifting from output to outcome. How does HR in general make sure that this is heard at the very senior level of the company, given I think there's still in many organizations kind of disconnect between what talents believe is right and therefore evaluate the company or offers from that perspective, while senior management occasionally still thinks it's about, well, the output rather than the outcome.
I think one of the most effective things that you can do as an HR partner in an organization is create relationships with all of the senior leaders. Once you, and I've always believed that you create strong relationships with leaders. I say it's operational excellence towards strategic partnership. So my advice would always be start delivering from day one as much as you can. Prove to the senior leadership team that you're effective, you're quick, you're responsive, and you know what you're talking about. And that'll lead you to create really strong relationships, because people in general will trust you when they realize that you do good work and you know what you're talking about. I think once you have those relationships formed, it's very easy to have those types of conversations with your senior leadership. I speak to our CEO, I think, bi-weekly. We talk about all of this stuff, like where's talent going? How should we be focused on managing? What messages should we be sending to the entire leadership organization? How should we be shifting the way that we think about and look at talent? It's easier in a startup, of course, but I think if you have a senior leader in HR that has the opportunity to build those relationships, it's the right approach. It's really kind of introducing that to your senior leadership team, creating trust with them. And then it's a question of trial and error too. Like, hey, maybe this will work. Let's try it out. Let's see what it does. Maybe it won't. Maybe it'll shift the business. Maybe it won't. But having that openness to try and creating those relationships with senior leaders, I think, is the most important element.
Giuseppe, thanks a lot. It was super insightful. I really enjoyed our conversation. Great, thanks.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Then all of you guys, thanks a lot for listening in. I'm pretty sure you learned a lot from our conversation today with Giuseppe. Thanks a lot and see you next time.